All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be tackling the discussion of expanding broadband for education today. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Education and CFI Standing Committees at the National Conference of State Legislatures. My name is Michelle Ekstrom, and I'm the Group Director for the Education Program, and also co-sponsor the Education Standing Committee with my counterpart in the Washington, D.C. office, Austin Reed, who you will hear from momentarily. So just a reminder about the protocols for today's virtual meeting. Please be sure to join us by video. We'd love to see your faces. It definitely helps to make things more interactive. So join us by video if you can. Be sure to type your full name into your title, and you can do that by clicking in the upper right-hand corner, the 3 dots, and add your full name just so we know who is with us today. Please be ready to contribute to the conversation by sharing your state's perspective if needed, and also by typing your questions into the chat box. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to make this as interactive as we possibly can. In the meantime, please be sure to mute your audio when you aren't speaking, just so we can have a more clear line for our speakers. And as I mentioned, please do type your questions or comments into the chat box. It's great to hear from you. And please don't share your screen under any circumstances. We have open sharing right now so that our speakers can share, but be sure that you don't accidentally share your own screen. And also a reminder that today's meeting is being recorded, and it will be archived and posted online for future reference. So our first speaker today is Christine Fox, who is the Interim Executive Director at CEDA, which is the Organization of State Directors of Technology. And in that role, she's charged with charting the strategic direction, administration, planning, and financial decisions involving CEDA. She also facilitates the members' online and in-person professional opportunities. They've just done a really great job at providing professional development and thinking during this time. In addition, she also manages their research and product development projects, and also supervises and consultants and staff, and coordinates data collection from all of the states to ensure that member input is gathered, and also supervises the publication process. She has a background and experience in education as an educational consultant and curriculum developer, and is also a former teacher as well. So welcome, Christine. We're so happy to have you. And at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I'm glad to be back. I was with your group in the spring as we were all adjusting, I guess, to the pandemic. So glad to be here. I'll just briefly share a bit about CEDA and then kind of dig into the topic of the day. Michelle set us up well. Our members at CEDA, we are a nonprofit organization. We're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary, focusing on supporting digital learning opportunities for all students. We specifically support state education agency leaders. We advocate, which you will hear about from us and the other groups, for policy and practice, which is so critical right now. As was mentioned, we provide professional learning and then interstate collaboration, as well as partnering with, and I see at least one of our partners on the call today, providing that ongoing dialogue between the public and private sector. So we do have 3 groups of CEDA members. We have the state leaders, so they typically are part of the state education agency. There are leaders that participate in CEDA that are outside of the SEA. That is often leaders around broadband, so folks that may run your state networks or facilitate your E-rate program, maybe in another state division, as well as some of the accessibility leaders we connect with also sometimes are outside of the state agency. But the majority of our members are SEA leaders. As I mentioned, our public-private sector partners, and we do have affiliates. So we have about 20 affiliates from across the country. Those are either member organizations or regional organizations focused on education, wanting to better understand and leverage the resources that CEDA offers to their members across their states or regions. And as Michelle kindly shared, CEDA has provided a variety of resources over the last 2 decades. All of our resources are available to the general public at no cost. And for the last probably 6 to 7 years, they've also been openly licensed. So I'll put some links in the chat when I'm finished talking to some of these resources that will probably be beneficial to you. And we focus, our big bucket areas are professional learning, equity of access, which we'll focus on today, digital learning, professional development, and interoperability. And as Michelle also mentioned, we did launch on March 16th, which was pretty early in the process, the CETA Coalition for E-Learning. This was a specific resource for all of those educators that are moving to digital learning in that rapid response. This particular tool, again, is open and available to the public. We really tried to focus on leveraging the 12 states that had policies around e-learning days. Most of those were for inclement weather in advance of the pandemic. And so we were able to leverage what they had learned over the last several years and what their districts had to put in place to provide examples, resources, sample plans, and focus on a variety of areas, all the way from sample lesson plans to parent considerations, and of course, resources around home access. So, I think one of the big questions, and I was actually interviewed by EdWeek this morning about digital learning and e-learning and the response to the pandemic. And, do we think we're just going to go back to the way things were in the fall of 2021, post-pandemic, with a vaccine? And some people are just be happy to go, back to the way it was. So CETA has argued and pushed forth since 2001 the fact that digital learning is truly an opportunity for equitable access to educational opportunities for all students, both pre and post pandemic, because it's a way to drive change. And with that, there are abilities to change teaching and learning opportunities, change the access to what students can take as far as courses, whether remediation or advanced, provides the ability for professional learning, and supports economic inclusion. As we all know, whether you're going to be an artist and you want to promote your pieces on social media and you need to be able to use an accounting tool to support your business, to mechanics who leverage diagnostic tools to fix our cars, through surgeons who are using so much technology now. We really need to develop lifelong learners, and technology is a way to drive that change and best prepare our students. So I always like to pause for a moment. I know as state legislators, you're many levels away. I work with state education agency leaders now, and we're often steps away from students, but I like to pause for a moment, look at these pictures, think about your own e-learners that may be at home, your colleagues that are teaching, your family and friends of, why are we doing this? Why are we talking about all this? And from what we've seen, a lot of the why, of course, we want equitable learning opportunities for all students. And there are a lot of caveats, there are a lot of pockets of excellence, as well as areas of struggle and places that don't have any connectivity at all right now. I'll celebrate a little bit of some of the exemplars of what we've heard. CETA hosted our leadership summit about a month ago. And during that event, we had a panel of stories of resilience. So these were 4 schools from LA Unified to Long Island, Utah, and Vermont, and educators as well as students sort of sharing how they've been able to find those pockets of excellence and really drive things forward during the pandemic. Nobody said it was easy, but we know that the dedication of so many teachers, the dedication of CETA members that drove hotspots out to the Navajo Nation to support access, to educators across the spectrum, and legislators like you are really driven by this why. And we want to be able to continue to support those students, especially with all the investments that have been made in the current pandemic. So specifically, we've kind of put things into a few buckets. One is quality blended learning opportunities for all students. I know there are a ton of terms out there, and we're actually working on a project with Dell Technologies around sharing all the definitions of the variety of digital learning, e-learning, blended learning, online learning. There's so many terms. So, but our ultimate goal is to provide those quality learning opportunities for students. So we're looking at having a framework, what does this look and sound like, and how is it a vehicle to personalize instruction? We know that with the investment in devices and the investment in broadband that has taken place and continues to take place, and some of the professional learning that has happened, we're able to kind of move things towards a more digital blended opportunities. Of course, the equity for all students, both connectivity to devices and that infrastructure is critical. And then ensuring that these learning opportunities are aligned to standards, not just the content standards, but also there are online learning standards, ed tech standards. And that's a place where CETA has been trying to work and share with leaders the online learning standards as well as the ed tech standards and how those all loop together. The importance of empowering educators so that they have meaningful learning opportunities. And then finally, the critical need for educational technology leadership. So I'm just going to dig into each of those a little bit. When we talk about equity of access, I probably don't need to rattle off a bunch of statistics to this particular group, and I'm sure that Evan is going to dive in a bit more as well. So we know that there still is a gap. There are students without access to connectivity at home. We know there are districts that are still printing packets because in order to provide equitable opportunities, and some students have access and some don't, they're just sending home big packets and calling students to try to help them. The other thing that I'm sure some of you have experienced, as have I, where my personal and professional life is colliding, where I have two e-learners at home. I'm presenting on Zoom. They're both in Google Classroom and somebody gets kicked off. And so that level and quality of access is so important. There is some work being done around what students do need at home. Some of you may be familiar with CETA's work. We published the Broadband Imperative, which was part of the E-rate modernization order, providing capacity targets for school access. And now really the question is, what level of access do you need at home? If everyone is having synchronous video or you're doing some dynamic content integration, then you probably do need a higher level of access. Specifically, and I think this is going to dig into a little bit more from some of the other presenters, but I did want to share that CETA has been very dedicated to supporting closing out the homework gap. Representative Ming from New York was actually CETA's Policymaker of the Year just about a month ago in the Emergency Education Act funding that she encouraged to support broadband through E-rate. And allowing the flexibility of an emergency response from the E-rate program to provide home access. Similarly, Senator Ed Markey had a similar companion bill in the Senate. And as of this weekend, and others on the call may have been part of a scramble over the weekend of we were connecting specifically with our members who were part of a bipartisan discussion in the Senate committee around connectivity for access, which last I heard, and as we know in DC, things move rather quickly. So there was about $10 billion in the new stimulus package for connectivity, including some of that funding directly funding through E-rate for students. And similarly, and I'm not sure of all the states on the call, but there have been state considerations, both states leveraging CARES Act funding. I know Pennsylvania and Texas leverage state level funding to support closing that gap for students at home. For the professional learning, and I would say when I was in an earlier conversation today, this is where one of the most critical factors, especially our membership, is considering. And part of that is because just because you have the tools in place does not mean that digital learning is happening efficiently and effectively. It's pretty overwhelming, as it was for many of you, to switch to online engagement for your jobs. It is difficult for the teachers to switch to teaching online. And as we move forward to hopefully more of a blended opportunity, there is a critical need for ongoing quality professional learning for educators. You know, a lot of folks, and I can tell you from my own students, my high school and middle schooler, you know, March and April, the teachers that already leverage technology had an easier transition, but more so the teachers that personalized instruction, the teachers that already differentiated were able to shift online and try to help meet the needs of each learner. Whereas educators that classically taught to the whole group were used to lecturing and not differentiating as much really struggled. And as we know, in the spring, there was a response to, we need to do something. And then schools and districts had the summer to sort of pause and reflect and provide professional development. And now I feel like more technology tools are being leveraged. People are kind of thinking outside the box. But there is an important need for that ongoing professional development, whether it's a teacher needing to understand how to use a learning management system, or more complex digital tools and resources, or using Zoom breakouts or whatever the tools are. And that's where coaching is so critical, and leveraging the leadership within the schools. And I'll talk about EdTech leadership. CETA did submit recommendations to the presidential transition team, President-elect Biden's transition team, around the importance of leadership at the US Department of Education. The Office of Ed Tech had really been sort of shrunk down to very minimal and was no longer part of the Secretary of Education's higher level cabinet. And I would say similarly in states, for some states, after Title II-D was eliminated, the Ed Tech office was eliminated. And pausing for a second, a lot of offices are either called Digital Learning or Office of Innovation now. Maybe they're not called Ed Tech, and that's not a big deal, but it's much more about the leadership for technology, to where our members, our SEA leaders, were then saying to us, well, I'm just an office of one, we've been shrunk down. And then all of a sudden, when the pandemic hit, the governors or the chief is saying, hey, why don't we have a team like they do in Utah or whatever other state has like a more comprehensive leadership. So we do at CETA encourage state level leadership. I think different now than in advance of the pandemic, where a lot of times the districts were everybody's local control, right? And the districts really didn't want anyone telling them what to do. Even now, they're calling the state saying, how do we set this up? I need to understand blended learning better. What can we do? They want that guidance and they want that leadership. And the transition was much easier in states that had some things in place versus those that did not. So I would just encourage legislators to really look at your structure and think about your leadership, and having that shared vision. You know, breaking down those silos is critical, and providing that opportunity, whether it's your policies and practices around digital learning, how your offices are structured to provide that leadership. We think a lot about those little small districts that don't have as many folks. They can't have an IT department, the principal's driving the bus. There are just so many things to consider. So as much as we can offer to those districts, the more seamless the digital learning opportunities would be. And so I probably didn't use all of my time, but I will leave it open for questions, or if you're going to transition to Evan, and then I can answer questions after.
So we'll take questions for Christine right now, if you have them. We did have one question in the chat box. Do you have any idea how much CARES money has been spent or will be spent on improving internet access? I know that both Evan and Austin will be speaking to that later, but I didn't know if you wanted to mention anything about that right now, Christine.
No, they probably have a more comprehensive data set. I do have I have the GEARS Act funding stats of what folks spent that on, but not as much and the acronyms escaping me of the other pocket of CARES Act money. The SEA side, yeah. I know a lot of districts, I'm sure they can share more specific statistics on that.
We do have a note here that Washington has focused a good chunk of the SEA CARES monies to provide access to low-income students. And I do know, just generally, and as I mentioned, Evan and Austin will be sharing, but we've seen quite a bit of activity here. I think this was a big concern, of course, for state agencies and for governors. So it's been encouraging to see that those federal funds were needed and are being spent in this area that I know educators and parents both feel like is important.
Definitely. I mean, honestly, I haven't heard of any state that didn't invest some of their funding. I could be wrong, but I know in Illinois and multiple other states, New Mexico, this was the major focus because they wanted to get the infrastructure in place. And the struggle is some are waiting for those devices, right? Because there was a backlog of ability to provide, whether it's a hotspot or a particular device for the students have access. So great intentions, and then there has been some backlog. Louisiana is another example. They ended up working with their districts, going door to door to best figure out student device and broadband to the home. And then, of course, they had multiple hurricanes that impacted their numbers that they had.
Right. And this is a good time too to remind everyone that NCSL is tracking all state level spending as well as legislation that relates to anything that relates to COVID under all the major policy areas. And you can find those databases on NCSL's website as well. I did have a couple of questions that I have.
Sure.
And others, just feel free to type them in the chat box if you think of them as we go along. I get a lot of questions about what is the optimal amount of time for students to be spending online. I know this is a concern of parents, but it also is a question that is coming up with my own school. It seems that teachers and principals may not even know what best practices are and how much actual screen time students should have. So, and I know there's a couple of different ways to answer this question, but I'm particularly thinking of students who, most of which right now seem to be in this virtual setting every day. So if you have online learning every day, and particularly for those who are in a synchronized learning situation, how much time is it optimal for them to be spending online?
So this is a point close to home as well. So I will tell you that what I think that most educators and in our membership of CETA, which I even see members sharing in the chat as well, is there needs to be a balance and there needs to be a consideration for student and how they learn, right? So particularly in the district where I live, all students are now required, if they're working from home, to be on video every day, all day. And that is very intense. And I would argue that's a bit too much, especially when, you know, you happen to walk away to use the restroom or the printer's in another room as our life, and you're missing. But you think about the content you have to cover and then looking reasonably. It's harder for, say, a high school teachers, because they don't know what their students are doing in the rest of the classes. Whereas if you're an elementary school teacher and you keep those students all day, you can probably break it up a little bit better. Our district has some pretty strict regulations, and I don't know that there's a magic number. I think it's just like anything else. You really have to think about the why, right? So if students are having a breakout discussion about a novel, or you're giving them extra time to do their homework, or they're practicing their flute, like my daughter, why do they have to be on video when she's practicing her flute? There has to be some level of trust and some level of why they're on that screen at that time. And I don't know that any researcher is going to come up with an exact number, because outside of school, of course, we know that they're spending a lot of time on screens, especially when they're confined in a pandemic. And there may be other parents of high schoolers here, but it's not just one screen at one time either, because there's this going on, right? There's the phone. at the same time as the screen, because this is how the class is really communicating, and then everything else is happening. So I'm sorry to give a vague, but I don't know that I think it really goes back to that why and the reason for the synchronous activities and what makes most sense for those kids.
That's really helpful. Thank you. We have a couple more questions. Is there any data that shows how many teachers had to do both remote and in person or in class teaching at the same time?
I haven't seen numbers like that. I know that our members have been talking. We have a weekly kind of get together for the membership, and they have been talking a lot about what models are your districts using. In most states, the districts had options, so they vary so much. And now there are, people flipping back. They were in person, now they're going back to online, and the whole concept of a couple of alternating days of the week or weeks at a time. And so I'm not aware of any data there. I just think it is very greatly, I live in Florida, the larger districts here do offer the option. Most of the districts offer the option in person or at home, and they did install cameras. So the teachers are teaching to both simultaneously.
I'll just add that I find this really interesting. Our own school district had a lot of pushback from teachers who were asked to do both. And the principals got together and decided that they felt like the best way to incentivize teachers who might want to do that, or who had off periods, who would be teaching an online only class when they weren't teaching their in-person classes, was to offer a stipend. So the state had given the school district enough flexibility that the district could opt to use some funds to offer a stipend to teachers who had agreed to do both, so that at least the teachers felt like they were being compensated. And I know a teacher from Denver Public Schools, who is not my school district, heard that. She was in the same meeting I was where we heard that. And she said that for her, that would have made all the difference. But to be asked to do both was just pretty overwhelming. And to not have any real incentive or to be rewarded in any way for having to do that was a little bit disheartening. So
Yes, I can only imagine. So I was a classroom teacher. Every day I am thankful for those that are at school and at home. I have one student now at home and one at school that are taking this on, because it's incredibly intense. And even my middle schooler said, "You don't understand. She's so busy." And I said, you can hear that the teachers have even told the kids, because they're feeling overwhelmed. I did want to share, there was a district in California that actually, the district in California that decided to, and I'll look it up and put in the chat because I could do both at once, where they took their teachers that wanted to teach online and their students that wanted to teach online and made that one cohort, and then everyone else was back in the building. And we've seen more of that, where also some districts offering some version of a virtual school, whether their own or a state virtual school, as an option. So that way the other teachers that were going to be on campus would address the students that are on campus, and the other students had virtual options. It is very challenging.
our district tried that and could not find enough online teachers, so they had to resort to having the in-person teachers also teaching the fully online students. So unfortunately, that was their reality. Okay, I am going to end here. Thank you, Christine, for your presentation.
Sure.
This time I'm going to turn it over to Heather. You will have additional opportunities to get your questions answered of Christine and all of our speakers if you are interested. Just keep typing those questions in the chat box. We appreciate your all of your thoughts and questions.
Thank you, Christine and Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, I am Heather Morton, and I staff NCSL's Communications, Financial Services, and Interstate Commerce Committee with my colleague, Abby Gruel. And now we'll turn to our next speaker, Evan Marwell, who is the founder and CEO of Education Superhighway. And in 8 years, Education Superhighway has helped close the digital divide in America's K-12 schools, connecting nearly 47 million students in 99.7% of America's classrooms to high-speed broadband. Evan is an honors graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Business School, And Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you. Just give me a minute to unshare my screen. There we go. Thank you.
Okay, well, nice to be here today. Let me share my screen. Okay, and let me just start the slideshow. Can everyone see? Great. All right, well, it's good to be here today. Thank you for that introduction, Heather. As Heather said, over the last 8 years at Education Superhighway, we focused on closing the K-12 school digital divide, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But since April, when the pandemic started, we actually pivoted the organization to work on solving the problem of the 10 to 15 million kids at the time who didn't have internet access at home and therefore were unable to actually attend school. And as I'll talk about throughout the presentation today, one of the things that we have learned both in our 8 years of working with states to close the digital divide at schools, but particularly as it relates to kids that don't have internet access at home, one of the biggest challenges has been getting good data on who is and isn't connected. And fortunately, as a result of some innovative things done in Chicago and the state of North Dakota, the ISP community has agreed to a partnership with us to help states and school districts figure out exactly the answers to those questions. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Before I get into that, though, just a little background on Education Superhighway. We started our work in 2012, and over the course of the last 8 years, we've partnered with all 50 states, in fact, 85 different governors from all 50 states to close the classroom connectivity gap. And this gives you a sense of where we were in 2013 and where we are when we started the school year in 2020. Really dramatic progress on getting schools that did not have fiber optic connections connected, on getting minimum levels of bandwidth. We went from 10% of kids to 99.7% of kids being able to use technology in the classroom by getting those fiber connections there and upgrading their bandwidth. And a big part of the way we did that was by leveraging data to drive the cost of bandwidth down from $22 a megabit per month to just under $2 a megabit per month today. So a 90% decrease. And these same basic concepts, building infrastructure, making things more affordable, having the data that we need to develop and execute a thoughtful plan, are the same things that we need to be able to do to close the digital divide for kids at home today. Today, there are still somewhere probably north of 10 million kids that don't have internet access at home. This was a map that we put up early, right at the start of the pandemic, with our estimates of how many kids in different states were not connected. The numbers range from 10 million to 15 million. Our best guess is that somewhere around 3+ million kids have been connected, based on data that we've gotten from ISPs, mobile providers, and others. And so we still have a big gap left to go. And a lot of what was able to drive that was that, as Christine was talking about before, states using their GRIERS money, which is what I've got on this on the screen right now, but also districts using the money that they got from CARES, really did allocate significant resources to closing the digital divide, to getting devices into students' hands. And the challenge, however, is that this money, as you all know, runs out. And the latest update that I just got not too long ago is that new money for broadband in the next stimulus bill is actually going to be more in the form of the block grants to governors, as opposed to going into the E-rate program. And so we're still going to be left with this challenge going forward of how do we keep kids connected, not just for the remainder of this school year, while many school districts are going to be doing either remote or hybrid learning, But how do we make sure kids can stay connected, and how do we close the homework gap going forward? I will say this also has really resulted in, I think, a tremendous amount of awareness that it's not just about closing the digital divide for kids at home, but the pandemic has shown that if you don't have broadband at home, it's hard for you to have a good job. It's hard for you to get training, to get a good job. It's hard for you to send your kids to school. It's hard for you to get access to healthcare, and it's hard for you to get access to government services. You know, if there is a moment that has made it incredibly clear how devastating the digital divide is for all Americans, not just kids, I think the pandemic has been that. And the good news is that we're seeing a lot of support for trying to do something about it. And the one key thing that I'll say is that closing the digital divide for all Americans, and frankly for all students, it's about two things. It's in part about infrastructure and building out infrastructure to the places that don't have it. But frankly, it's even more about affordability. If you look at the data on who isn't connected in America, more than half of the people who don't have internet connections actually have infrastructure available to them today, but simply can't afford it. So those are the two twin problems that, whether you're talking about kids or you're talking about the digital divide writ large, we're going to need to solve. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the work we did in closing the classroom connectivity gap. And it's pretty much the same story here. There are three key issues that prevent school districts from closing the home connectivity gap. The first is data. School districts have had an incredibly hard time figuring out which students are and are not connected and which ISPs can serve them. You know, most school districts relied on, you know, traditional survey approaches to trying to figure out the answer to this. And generally speaking, they would at best get 30 to 40% response rates. So it's been a tremendous problem for districts to figure out how to solve this problem, in part because they don't know who is and isn't connected. The second problem has obviously been funding. And as I showed a minute ago, there's been good efforts by states and school districts to purchase affordable home broadband on behalf of their students, but funding is going to be an ongoing issue as we turn the calendar into 2021. The third issue, which actually is an incredibly important one, is adoption roadblocks. You know, families that do not have internet access at home face a whole bunch of hurdles in trying to do it. Trying to get it. It starts with an information gap. Most families really don't understand, you know, what low-cost home broadband services are available to them, how they get them. Then becomes sort of the complexity of signing up for these services, especially for families where English is a second language. I mean, it's a lot of work to actually get signed on. Then there are documentation issues. Many of the ISPs historically have required people to provide social security numbers and things like that, which many of the families that are not connected, that have kids in school, can't provide and therefore can't get signed up for these services. And then finally, there's what I would call the credit problem. You know, if a family has outstanding bad debt with a service provider or just doesn't have a good enough credit rating, they haven't been able to sign up for these services. So these are the challenges that have, you know, prevented school districts from closing the K-12 home connectivity gap. And these same challenges are really, frankly, what prevent the nation from closing the digital divide at large. And so, so the question is, how do you overcome these? And the interesting thing is that there's been a lot of creative work going on in cities, in school districts, and in states to come up with new solutions and new approaches to this. And the one I want to highlight today, which really has served as the model for the program that we've now introduced on a national basis, is Chicago Connected. And as I said at the top of the presentation, this is a very similar thing to what North Dakota did for its students as well. So Chicago approached this problem with really two key innovations. The first was, how were they going to get their data? And what they decided to do was create a data sharing agreement with their local ISPs. And then second, use an aggregated procurement model where the district not the individual families, were responsible for buying the service. And those two things, and I'll walk you through what they did, but those two things really overcame those first and third roadblocks that districts have had. And then they were able to leverage CARES funding as well as significant philanthropy to actually pay for the service as well. So what did Chicago do? Well, the first thing they did was try to figure out who is and isn't connected. And they took the 355,000 student addresses that they had in their student information system. And under NDA, they gave them to the local ISPs in an anonymized format without any student names. The ISPs then agreed to identify which addresses had home broadband already and which of the unconnected addresses each of them could serve within a 10-day period. This was game-changing. Never before had an ISP agreed to provide this information to a school district, frankly, let alone anybody else. But it is a game changer because instead of relying on surveys where you only get 30 or 40% response rates, this enabled Chicago to quickly identify the 100,000 students in 60,000 homes that did not have home broadband. And once you have that kind of specific information, you can put together a thoughtful plan. And what Chicago did was they issued an RFP to procure broadband for those homes. And it turned out 92% of them could be connected with existing infrastructure. The other 8% were largely students that were either homeless or in temporary living situations where they needed to actually get them a mobile solution. So it got them the data they needed, but by doing the procurement as a district procurement, as opposed to relying on families to do it, it also eliminated that information gap, the credit and debt problems, and the documentation barriers for families. And so Chicago quickly connected over half of its households before the start of the school year, and then has been continuing to add on more and more households as the year's gone on. As I mentioned, North Dakota used the exact same approach, and they were able to connect 99.8% of their students to home broadband. So this was really innovative. It was a different way of thinking about things brought on by the pandemic. And frankly, I think only possible because of the pandemic, because the ISPs decided we need to do something differently to try and help these kids. So we saw this happening and we said, look, if ISPs are willing to do this, this is a program that needs to be taken national. So we approached the 4 national telecom associations, the cable providers, the telecom providers, the rural telecom providers, the small cable providers, and we launched a program called K-12 Bridge to Broadband. And this program is designed to essentially replicate or enable states and districts to replicate what Chicago and North Dakota did. And there are 5 core principles. The first is that service providers have agreed to create what they call a sponsored service offering for school districts, states, or other entities. This means they're going to allow school districts and states to buy broadband on behalf of their families that don't have home internet access. The second is they've agreed to work with the school districts or states to identify which students need service using this data exchange strategy that Chicago and North Dakota deployed. Third, they've agreed to a baseline set of eligibility standards. At least any family that's on the free and reduced lunch program is able to participate. And in order to maximize adoption, they've minimized the amount of information necessary for families to sign up for the services. So in essence, once the school district does the procurement, they're given a set of codes that they can hand out to families, and pretty much all the families need is that code in order to sign up, eliminating all the documentation requirements, credit checks, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the companies agreed that as part of the data exchange, that they're not going to use that data they get from the school districts for marketing, which is something that obviously everybody was sensitive to. So we were able to get these 4 national associations to agree to it. And today we have 9 of the top 10 service providers, internet service providers participating, and we're covering over 80% of the households in the United States with this program. So now we're just in the process of rolling this out and doing our first pilots, and I'll walk you through a little bit of that. But for states, the K-12 Bridge to Broadband program really gives you the data that you need to close the K-12 home broadband gap. What does it do? Well, first, it gives you actionable data so that you can understand which students are and aren't connected down to the household address level, along with which are the service providers that can actually connect each of those households. Second, it allows you to prioritize connectivity upgrades based on that data so that you can get connectivity to the students who need it most. And third, and we found that in our work with schools, this was incredibly important. It gives you the data to make the case for increased investment in internet connectivity in unconnected regions throughout the state. So whether it's to help close that affordability gap or to see, wow, for the first time, here are the places in our state that really don't have internet access. So how do we make the case for investment? How do we use money that might come from the federal government to make sure that infrastructure gets built out into those areas? As I said before, when we were working to connect schools, this kind of data was critical to our success, particularly around getting fiber to schools that didn't have it. There were 24 states across the country that put up over $200 million in matching funds to the federal E-rate program to build fiber to schools. And the reason that those legislatures and governors were willing to do it, and the ones who didn't, frankly, just didn't need to do it because they were mostly connected, was because they had concrete data that showed exactly which schools needed to be connected and who would benefit as a result of that. So that's why I think this is a great program. And here's where we stand today. Our goal is to conduct statewide data exchanges with at least 20 states by next summer. We currently are piloting in 5 states, validating sort of our secure data exchange platform that we've built to facilitate the exchanges between states or school districts and service providers and the business processes that are needed to support that. In January and February, we'll be expanding that to make sure that we've conducted data exchanges with all the major providers so that they're all ready to roll, because we know that will be the vast majority of the folks that are going to be providing the data. And then our goal is that in March, April, May, and June, that we are scaling this with states so that all of you have the data that you need to start running procurements this summer to be able to make sure that kids who aren't back in school in the fall, that kids who otherwise are suffering from the homework gap can get connected come the start of the next school year. So I'm going to stop there. Grace Ting, who's one of our state relationship management directors, contact info is there on the screen. So if you want to follow up about getting started in your state, you can email me or you can email her. And I'm happy to take some questions now.
Thank you so much, Evan. Really fast so that we stay on time, I've got a quick question for you. So for the families who lack or have limited digital literacy and all of these attempts to get them connected, if they don't have like the technical know-how, right? The problem happens, what do? Do you have any suggestions on what policymakers can do to help families when they run into problems, like just technical problems and they can't get on the internet and they can't get it to work while trying to get the student into class?
Yeah, so part of what we did early in our work on the pandemic was we launched playbooks for school districts and for states on how to deal with a variety of issues. And one of those issues was, how do you provide technical support? So if you go to the digitalbridgek12.org website, you can find that playbook under the sort of broader heading of rolling out a device lending program. But fundamentally, it's the same problem that schools have faced for a long time. And really what you need to be doing is making sure that your school districts have the resources available to provide the kind of technical support. And the good news is, thanks to the work of CETA and COSA and a number of other organizations, there are a lot of good models out there for how to do that. There are a lot of school districts that have had one-to-one programs now for a number of years, and they've had to figure out solutions to that. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And now we'll turn to my colleague, Austin Reed, who is the committee director for the NCSL Education Committee, who will give us an overview on NCSL's federal work.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and then we're going to talk about federal responses to the digital divide. Let's see. Hopefully you all can see my screen. All right. So I'm going to pick up on a few loose threads that have come up in our conversation today. And first taking a look at just what the CARES Act has done in terms of helping states respond to this digital divide. From our tracking, and this is pretty similar to Evan's tracking, we've targeted or found that at least 39 states have pledged funds to close the digital divide, and there's different ways in which they've done that. We've pulled this data from about 4 different CARES funding streams. We've talked about a few of them today. The Governor's Education Relief Fund is one of them. There's the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is that flexible aid for states. And there's a couple of smaller funds. We've tracked the state set aside and the elementary and secondary emergency relief funds. And there was also a small competitive grant from the Department of Education that we included in our analysis. One thing to note is that we haven't actually been able to dig down into how districts have spent about, I think it's $12 billion in funds that they were given. So what we've been able to analyze is simply at the state level. And what we found is, at least top line number, and I think this is very similar to Evan's number, is that about $1.3 billion has been offered in dedicated funding. My Microsoft Word is making me choose options that I wasn't ready to choose. So anyway, we think about $1.3 billion from these different funding streams have been dedicated directly to responding to the digital divide. And then there's about another $400 million out there that allows states the option, or allows actually districts the option of addressing the digital divide. And similar to the conversation we've had today, we sort of divided out state responses into 3 areas. We've seen states provide internet connectivity to students, as well as make devices available to schools and students, or provide online reading or online learning resources. Let's talk about those 3 areas really quickly. In terms of internet connectivity, there's been about 3 major strategies that we've seen emerge through state plans. One, and I think this is the most common one, has been districts offering temporary access points to students. So the state or the district might install broadband extenders at their schools and libraries. They might give wireless hotspots to students and families. We've even seen a number of states use Wi-Fi equipped buses to provide these supports. We've also seen a couple states, particularly Connecticut and the District of Columbia, provide direct support for families. So they have paid the internet bills of students and families directly. Then finally, this is another, I think, a less common strategy, and we only have 2 examples of this, but some states have chosen to invest in specific infrastructure for providing broadband, mostly to rural communities. So we've seen Arizona pledge $40 million for broadband fiber, and Maryland has also said that they're going to create a wireless education network out there for families. So those are kind of the 3 main strategies we've seen in terms of internet connectivity. I wish we could put a specific dollar amount that states have pledged towards just connectivity, but the way that these funds are granted is it's sometimes hard to track how much or how states are divvying out these funds based on the categories that we've identified. And in terms of device availability, we've seen kind of 2 major strategies. I think the most common strategy is that the districts are given the authority to distribute the devices to students. So we've seen this in a number of states, but there's also been some state programs where they're providing direct support to the families to purchase either those devices or that connectivity. And sometimes we've seen states provide direct support to families to purchase both the device and the connectivity at the same time. In fact, actually in Maine, I believe they distributed about 15,000 devices to students and families across the state, and those devices were connected to internet, so they kind of killed 2 birds with 1 stone there. And then finally, in terms of the digital divide, we have seen states make some investments in their online learning platforms, as well as giving students access to content and curriculum. This has been, I think, the smallest share of funds that states have invested towards addressing the digital divide, but these are important. Some good examples here. Virginia has created or has invested in their an online learning portal for teachers to be able to provide personalized instruction for students, and as well as for teachers to facilitate professional development amongst themselves. And then over in the content and curriculum area, we've seen states like Oklahoma and Montana try to create platforms to provide access to coursework and other enrollment opportunities for students. So, in terms of CARES funding, this is so far what we've been able to track in terms of investments that states have been able to make. There's some other federal areas of note in terms of, at least over at the Federal Communications Commission. We know that back in April, they extended the E-rate service implementation and filing deadlines out until June. That was a response to the pandemic. But then in September, they announced a second funding window in 2020 to allow schools to request additional E-rate funding. And then just in October, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau in the FCC announced that the first time that they were granting licenses to for the wavelengths 2.5 gigahertz stream to try to address connectivity issues in rural tribal areas. And so that was a pretty significant action that they've taken as well. And we've talked about this earlier. Will there be more funding for states to be able to address the digital divide? It seems to be the case that will happen. I know that there's ongoing negotiations about a potential new stimulus package. I would guess that the money that goes towards education and to state and local governments would have the option of being able to be used for the digital divide. But right now there is a proposed $10 billion to address the digital divide, as I think both Christine and Evan mentioned. In terms of reporting, there hasn't been a specific, that $10 billion for broadband. There hasn't been public details about how that set of money would be used to address broadband, whether it be funding for E-rate, or I think Evan mentioned that he might have some intel that they may actually give it out as block grants to governors, which I think would be probably very state friendly. So we're still trying to figure out the details on that, but it does seem as though there will be additional funds in a next stimulus package whenever that is passed, and that could be in the next week or two, or it could be in a longer time horizon. So that's just kind of an overview of what we know in terms of tracking the last stimulus package and trying to anticipate what this next one will look like.
Thank you so much, Austin. That's great information. We still have a couple of minutes for Q&A. So as a reminder, please feel free to type in any questions you might have into the chat box. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I've got a couple on hand. Actually, I think I will pose these both to Christine and to Evan. Recognizing that solving the digital divide will take time, to build this infrastructure. Do you have examples of some of the creative solutions that states or schools or local governments have taken to get remote learning set up for the students in this sort of the short term? I remember seeing something about setting up Wi-Fi in school buses for students that didn't have access.
Yes, that is, the buses actually had even been an example in advance of COVID. One of the more innovative things that happened probably August, September was putting a cell tower on a flatbed truck and driving it out to one of the Native American communities in New Mexico. That was a way to kind of take the broadband to them in a different way. There are some of the technologies that people are still bouncing around with balloons and satellite that I can't give you a specific example of that, but I'll find a link and put in the chat about the Navajo Nation and the cell tower on wheels.
That'll be great.
The other thing we're seeing is people are setting up essentially remote learning centers where kids can come get good internet access, be supervised in a socially distant way. This is happening right now in New York, in Philadelphia, in San Francisco. It's even happening in some school districts are saying, okay, we're remote, but we're going to allow students to come to school and use our Wi-Fi, supervised not by teachers, but by paraprofessionals or others. So I think that's actually a really innovative approach.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's see. It looks like we've got 1 o'clock, or I'm at 1 o'clock. Michelle, I don't know. Do you want, if people want to stay over a couple of minutes or to take a couple more questions, or we can go ahead and wrap up? I don't know if Christine and Evan have time.
We don't have any reason for a hard stop at 1. So if there's couple more burning questions, we can go ahead and get to those.
Okay, perfect. I've got a couple more. Let's see. So, for both of you, actually, I guess, would you share your thoughts on I know that there's been proposals and discussions about expanding the FCC's E-rate program. Of course, it's primarily the money's focused at schools and libraries, but the proposals that are out there, they're floating around about actually allowing that money to be spent on the home connection, sort of to bridge this what was the homework gap and just this remote learning?
Yeah, so with CETA, we understand that, however, additional funding is distributed, there can be pluses and minuses. Specifically, we have provided what we considered suggestions for a special pocket of E-rate funding, so emergency response funding through E-rate. There are a lot of elements in place through the E-rate program, but we know that the classic E-rate application process and procurement process, it would be too delayed. So we have submitted considerations to the FCC around this, encouraging leveraging E-rate because it is a program that the districts understand and know, and then giving those caveats to allow it for home access at this time.
Yeah, so I mean, the reality is that the E-rate program is a $4 billion a year program. And for the last several years, thanks in large part to the tremendous decreases in the cost of internet access for schools, it really hasn't used more than $3 billion. So there's about $1 billion of available cap that could be used to solve this problem. I think that, from our point of view, we believe that we should expand it to serving, to being able to buy connections for students at home. But that funding should come as a second priority to whatever money is needed by schools for the connections that E-rate really needs to fund first priority. E-rate, as Christine said, it's a program that districts know how to use. It's also a program that has two other really important advantages. One, it is an aggregated procurement model, right? So it's what I was talking about in having schools be the buyer as opposed to families being buyer and getting over all those things. The other thing about the E-rate program is it requires a match. And because it requires a match from the school districts, that means that school districts are good stewards of this money, and it really only gets used for things that school districts really need. And we've seen that over and over and over again over the last 8 years. So we're supportive of doing that. I agree, on a temporary basis, there's some emergency things that need to be done to address the timing. But look, if we're going to close the homework gap, if we're going to close the digital divide writ large in America, we need to start thinking about programs like E-rate and what role they can play in order to solve the affordability components of the digital divide.
Thank you both for answering that question. I don't necessarily want to impose too much more on your time, so I will go ahead and we will do our little wrap up. So definitely I want to thank Christine, Evan, and Austin for sharing their time and expertise on today's webinar. And thank you to everyone in the audience for taking the time to participate with us this afternoon. Just so you know that the archive of today's webinar will be posted on NCSL's website. It'll probably take a few days to get that up. And so to find that archive, you'll just need to go to www.ncsl.org. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll get that other link.